Something about the way the sky boils with dark clouds, the low rumble of thunder rolling in, and the way the wind changes, carrying an energy that feels almost alive. It's exhilarating. But that was before I learned that something else moves with the storms. Something that isn't part of the rain or the wind or the lightning. Something that waits for the thunder to hide its footsteps. And once you hear it, it's already too late. It started last summer, during one of the worst storms I'd ever seen. I was house-sitting for my uncle, who had a place just outside of town. It wasn't isolated, but there was a decent stretch of woods behind the house and not a lot of neighbors close by. The storm had started rolling in that evening, dark clouds swallowing the sky, the air thick and charged with electricity. By the time night fell, the wind was howling, the rain hammering against the windows. I was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching TV when I heard the first knock. I froze. It was faint, almost lost beneath the storm. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then, knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. Someone was at the back door. I hesitated before standing, glancing at the kitchen window that overlooked the backyard. Lightning flashed, and I saw a figure standing just beyond the porch. Not moving, not knocking, just watching the house. My stomach dropped. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wasn't supposed to have visitors. And who the hell would be out there in the middle of a storm like this? Another knock. I turned toward the back door, swallowing hard. I could just make out a silhouette through the rain-streaked glass. Tall, still, a stranger, standing too close to the house. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, a whisper, muffled by the storm, but I heard it. Let me in. The voice didn't sound right. It was too low, almost distorted, like someone trying to speak underwater. I took a slow step back. Another flash of lightning. The figure was closer now, right at the door. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then, they knocked again. Slow, measured, like they weren't in a hurry, like they knew I had nowhere else to go. I grabbed my phone with shaking fingers and dialed 911. The call didn't go through. Of course, the storm. I was alone. No power, no help, no way out. And then, I heard the doorknob turn. The breath caught in my throat. I had locked the door. I was sure of it, but the knob was turning. Like someone on the other side was testing it, seeing if I had forgotten. And then, the worst part, a whisper, right against the glass. I know you're in there. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I ran for the hallway, my heart hammering, my pulse loud in my ears. As I reached the bedroom, I heard the kitchen window rattle. I turned just in time to see a hand pressing against the glass. Long fingers, too long, smudging against the rain-slicked surface. I barely had time to slam the bedroom door shut before I heard the sound of shattering glass. The kitchen window. They were inside. I shoved a dresser against the door, locking it, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, wet, moving through the house. I pressed a hand over my mouth, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps reached the hallway. Then, they stopped, right outside the bedroom door. The storm raged outside. The wind howled. And then, a whisper, just on the other side of the door. Let me in. I shook my head, even though I knew they couldn't see me. Didn't dare move. Didn't dare breathe. Then, the handle turned. Once. Twice. A long pause. And then, they laughed. A slow, broken laugh. Like they found this funny. Like they were enjoying this. The footsteps moved away, but I knew they weren't gone. Not yet. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room for a brief second. I turned toward the closet door and froze, because in the mirror across the room, I could still see them, standing in the hallway, watching me, even though the door was still shut. I closed my eyes, heart hammering. The storm outside was getting louder. The wind rattled the windows, shaking the house. Then, the door handle rattled again, harder this time, and I knew they weren't going to leave until I let them in. The door handle rattled again, harder this time, not a slow, testing movement like before. This time, it was violent, like someone was yanking at the door, desperate to get inside. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath sharp and ragged. heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. Then, silence. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. The storm raged outside. The wind howled. The rain hammered the roof. The thunder shook the house. But inside, everything was still. And then, a whisper, right outside the door. "I know you're in there." I felt my stomach turn. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was my voice. The exact tone. The same tremor of fear. Like something was repeating my thoughts back at me. I clenched my jaw, pressing my hands over my ears, but the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, until it was right against the door. "Let me in." I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head, biting down on my lips so hard I tasted blood. And then, the power came back. The bedroom flooded with light. The silence was suffocating. I waited, listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No whispers. Nothing. Just the low rumble of thunder fading into the distance. Slowly, I got up, made my way toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear anything. Still nothing. So, against every ounce of survival instinct I had left, I unlocked it. And slowly, I opened the door. The hallway was empty. The floors were dry, like no one had ever been inside. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. My stomach twisted as I stepped out into the hallway, my hands trembling. I forced myself to look down the stairs. The kitchen window was intact. No broken glass. No footprints. No sign that anyone had ever stood in the storm. But that's when I noticed. The back door was unlocked. Even though I knew, I had never opened it. I walked toward it, my heart in my throat. I reached out, barely touching the handle when a loud clap of thunder shook the house. And for a split second, in the reflection of the kitchen window, I saw something standing behind me, tall, still, watching. I turned instantly, and there was nothing there. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I didn't sleep that night, didn't even try. Instead, I sat on the couch with every light in the house blazing, my back against the wall, waiting, listening. But nothing came. The storm passed. The power stayed on. And when morning came, it was as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. And I knew. It wasn't over. Not yet. I left my uncle's house that day. Told him I wasn't staying there again. I didn't tell him why. Didn't tell anyone. I just went home. Tried to forget. Tried to convince myself that maybe it was a dream, or a trick of the storm, or some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Until, a week later, it followed me. The next thunderstorm came out of nowhere. The sky went dark in minutes, the air turning thick and heavy. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain, trying not to think about that night. Then, my phone lit up. A notification. A single text message. "Unknown number. Let me in." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my entire body frozen. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, another text. "Unknown number. I know you're home." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to sit up. This had to be a prank, right? A sick joke? Then, ding dong. The doorbell rang. I felt my blood turn to ice. No, 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 no. I knew what was happening. I wasn't at my uncle's house anymore. I was home, hundreds of miles away. But somehow, it found me. The rain pounded against the windows. The doorbell rang again, and then, a knock. Slow, deliberate. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking violently, dialed 911. But just like before, the call wouldn't go through. And then, just like before, I heard it, a whisper, right outside the door. "Let me in." And this time, it sounded excited, like it had been waiting for me, like it had finally found what it was looking for. I didn't open the door, didn't look out the window, didn't move. I just sat there, waiting, listening. And just as suddenly as it started, the storm stopped, the rain faded, the air went still, and when I finally worked up the nerve to check the door, there was nothing there. No footprints, no messages, no sign that anything had ever happened. Except for one thing. Scratched into the wood of my front porch were 3 words. "See you soon." I never sleep through storms anymore, because I know what's waiting in the dark. This happened when I was 18, living with my dad on the outskirts of a small town. He had a few acres of land, mostly flat, with nothing but tall grass and old barbed wire fences separating us from the highway in the distance. We had one neighbor, a farmer named Tom, but his house was a mile down the road. For the most part, it was just us out there. Quiet, safe, until the night he showed up. The storm rolled in around 10 p.m. I had been sitting in my room, scrolling through my phone, when the power flickered. Then, a loud crack of thunder shook the whole house. A second later, the lights went out. I sighed, grabbing my flashlight. "Hey, Dad," I called. No answer. I figured he was asleep, but when I stepped into the hallway, I realized something was off. The front door was wide open. A cold gust of wind rushed through the house. The rain was pouring outside, hitting the wooden porch like 1,000 little drum beats. I stepped forward, heart pounding. "Dad?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. The storm rumbled overhead. Then, a flash of lightning, and in the distance, out past the tall grass, I saw someone standing in the field. I froze. For a split second, I thought it was my dad. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized this man was too tall. His arms were too long. His head tilted slightly, like he was listening. Another flash of lightning, and this time, I saw his face. Or at least, I should have. But there was nothing there. Just a smooth, featureless surface, like someone had erased his face completely. Then, as the thunder roared, he took a step closer. A jolt of terror shot through me. I stumbled backward, gripping the doorframe. The figure in the field didn't move fast, just one slow step at a time, like he had all the time in the world. Then, from behind me, thud, something fell inside the house. I turned fast and nearly screamed. My dad was lying on the floor at the end of the hallway, unconscious, soaking wet. His clothes were drenched, as if he had been standing in the rain for hours. I ran to him, shaking his shoulders. "Dad, wake up." His eyes fluttered open, his face pale. For a moment, he just stared past me, his lips trembling. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Don't let him in." A chill ran down my spine. I turned back to the door, but the figure was gone. The field was empty. The tall grass swayed in the wind, untouched, like no one had ever been there. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew the night wasn't over. I managed to drag my dad onto the couch. His breathing was shallow, his hands ice cold. I grabbed a blanket, wrapping it around him. "What happened?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, just stared at the ceiling, his expression vacant, like he wasn't really there anymore. Then, after a long silence, he whispered. I heard him in the storm. I felt my blood run cold. "Him?" I repeated. My dad's fingers twitched. He was calling my name. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "Who? The guy in the field?" Dad's eyes snapped to mine. "You saw him?" I hesitated. Then, a knock at the door. I felt my stomach drop. A slow, deliberate knock, like whoever was outside wasn't in a hurry. I turned toward the door. The porch light was out, leaving the front of the house shrouded in darkness. Another knock. Then, a voice. "Let me in." I nearly jumped out of my skin. The voice was wrong. Low, distorted, like it was coming through an old, broken radio. My dad clutched my wrist. "Don't answer," he whispered. I nodded. I wasn't going to. But then, the kitchen door creaked open. I spun around. The back door was unlocked, swinging slowly in the wind. I felt a wave of pure dread wash over me. We had locked that door. I knew we had. The rain poured inside, soaking the kitchen floor. And then, in the darkness beyond the door, I saw him, standing just outside. Lightning flashed, illuminating the figure. This close, I could see every detail. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his too thin frame. His arms hung at his sides, motionless. And where his face should have been was nothing. A smooth, empty surface, like something had wiped it clean. He stepped forward, and in that same broken voice, he whispered, "I found you." I slammed the door, bolted it. My dad gasped for air, his whole body shaking. I grabbed the kitchen chairs, shoving them against the door for good measure. The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain. Then, a whisper. Not outside. Behind us. Why are you hiding? I didn't turn around. Couldn't. Because I knew. He was already inside. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. Because I knew. He was already inside. The room was silent, except for the soft drip, drip, drip of rainwater pooling onto the floor. I could feel something behind me. Not moving. Not breathing. Just waiting. My dad's grip on my wrist tightened. "Don't look," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, like his throat was raw from screaming. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to stay still. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and something sour. The wind howled outside, rattling the house like it was trying to shake us loose. Then, I heard it. A slow, wet footstep on the tile, followed by another, and another, until he was right behind me. The footsteps stopped. A long silence stretched between us. Then, a whisper, right against my ear. "I found you." My whole body locked up. The voice was low, broken, like it was being played through an old, warped cassette tape. I felt something shift behind me, the air growing colder. My dad squeezed my wrist so hard it hurt. "Close your eyes," he whispered. I already had. But then, I felt it lean in. Close. So close I could feel the dampness of its breath. And in that warped, inhuman voice, it whispered, "Why won't you let me in?" I snapped. I grabbed the closest object, a wooden chair, and spun around, swinging wildly. The chair slammed into empty air. Nothing was there. The kitchen was empty, except for the rainwater pooling on the floor. The door was still locked. The chairs were still barricading it. But he was gone. Or worse, he had never needed the door to come inside. My dad was breathing hard, his face pale and drenched in sweat. I turned to him, my hands trembling. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. He didn't answer, just stared past me, his eyes wide with fear. Then, barely above a breath, he muttered, "He's still here." I felt my blood run cold. I turned my head slowly, and there, standing in the hallway, was a shadow. It wasn't a person, not anymore. It was tall, thin, its limbs too long, its head slightly tilted, like it was listening. The hallway was pitch black, but I could see it. Or rather, I could see the absence of it, like it was swallowing the light around it, like it was nothing but a hole in the world. And then, it moved. It didn't walk. It glided, its feet barely touching the ground. It wasn't supposed to be here. It didn't belong. But somehow, it had found a way inside. I grabbed my dad, yanking him toward the living room. We stumbled over furniture, knocking over a lamp, desperate to get away. But then, every light in the house flickered, and the moment they did, the thing was closer. My dad let out a strangled gasp, gripping his chest. I held on to him, dragging him toward the front door. We had to get out. We had to leave. But the moment we reached the door, something pounded against it from the other side. A loud, violent knock. Then another. Then another. Like something was trying to break in. Or worse, trying to keep us from leaving. I backed away, my dad struggling to breathe beside me. The knocking stopped, and then, a voice, right on the other side. "Let me in." It wasn't human. It pretended to be. It mimicked voices, repeated words. But whatever it wasn't alive. Not in the way we were. And then, the knocking came from the windows. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, hands pressed against the glass, smudged and wet, like they had been dragged through the mud. And outside, through the rain, more figures stood in the field. Dozens of them, tall, motionless, watching, the same faceless, blank heads, all of them facing the house, all of them waiting. My dad let out a strangled breath, and then, the storm stopped. The rain vanished. The wind died instantly. The air became still, like the world had been paused. I turned to my dad, my pulse hammering in my ears. His face was pale, his lips barely moving. I could hear him muttering something under his breath, a prayer. Then, The lights flickered once, and every single figure outside was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did my dad. We sat in the living room, waiting, listening, but the knocking never came back. The storm never returned. By sunrise, it was like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. We both did. We left that house a week later. Packed up, moved. Didn't tell anyone why. But sometimes, when the sky turns dark with thunder and the wind starts to howl, I think about that night. I think about the figures in the field. I think about the knocking at the door. And I wonder, what would have happened if I had let him in? I was 16 when it happened, and to this day, I still have no real explanation for what I saw that night. The human brain is good at rationalizing things, turning something unnatural into something mundane just so you can sleep at night. But no matter how much I try, no matter how much I tell myself it was just some deranged person looking for shelter from the storm, deep down, I know that isn't true. It was mid-July, and the thunderstorms that time of year were brutal where I lived. Not just the heavy rain or the frequent power outages, but the wind. The kind of wind that howled through the trees, making them groan and creak like something alive. The kind of wind that made you feel like if you stepped outside, it could pick you up and throw you across the yard. I was home alone that night. My parents gone for the weekend on a last-minute trip, leaving me in charge of our little house in the middle of nowhere. Now, being alone in that house wasn't anything new to me. We lived in a rural part of the state, far from any real neighbors, with nothing but an old dirt road leading in and out of the area. Most kids my age would be terrified of the isolation, but I always loved it. Something about the quiet, the solitude, it made me feel safe. That night, though, that sense of security disappeared. I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with my laptop, watching YouTube videos while the storm raged outside. The power had flickered a few times, but it hadn't gone out completely yet. The rain pounded against the windows, and every so often, lightning would flash across the sky, lighting up the entire room like a camera flash. I was barely paying attention to anything other than my screen when I heard it. A knock at the front door. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not frantic, not urgent, just patient. I froze. We didn't get visitors. Not out here, and especially not during a thunderstorm in the middle of the night. My stomach twisted as I stared at the door, my mind racing with explanations. Maybe it was my parents, home early for some reason, but no, they would have called first. Maybe a lost traveler? No one came down this road unless they knew exactly where they were going. Another knock. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My brain screamed at me to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home. But something about the knocking. It wasn't desperate, it wasn't pleading. It was expectant. Like whoever was on the other side already knew I was there. I stood up slowly, creeping toward the door as quietly as possible. My hands were clammy as I reached for the peephole, pressing my eye against it. And that's when my stomach dropped. There was no one there. Just the empty porch, the rain-soaked yard, and the shadows of the trees swaying violently in the wind. I took a shaky step back, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just heard. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I had heard the knocks, clear as day. Had someone run away? But that didn't make sense. The only way off the porch was the front steps, and I would have seen them. Lightning flashed, illuminating the front yard for a split second. And that's when I saw it. A figure. A tall, thin figure standing at the very edge of the tree line, completely motionless. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was facing the house, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light, where the shadows swallowed most of its details. But I could still make out the unnatural stillness, the way it didn't even seem to flinch despite the wind whipping through the trees. I blinked, and another bolt of lightning lit up the yard. The figure was closer now. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My heart was slamming against my ribs, my ears ringing with the deafening crash of thunder. I turned away from the door, fumbling for my phone on the couch. My fingers trembled as I unlocked it, the screen lighting up my pale, panicked face. No service. Of course. The storm must have knocked out the towers. I forced myself to take slow, deep breaths, trying to think. I could hide in my room, lock the doors, wait for morning. Whatever it was, it hadn't tried to break in yet. And then the power went out. Everything was swallowed in darkness. The only light came from the occasional bursts of lightning outside. I stood frozen in the pitch-black living room, gripping my phone like a lifeline. My breathing was too loud, too ragged, and I forced myself to quiet down, to listen. That's when I heard it. Not from the front door this time. Not from the porch. From inside the house. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the hallway wall. I wasn't alone anymore. The tapping sound sent a wave of ice through my veins. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingers across the wall just to let me know they were there. I was frozen, standing in the pitch-black living room, my only source of light being the dim glow of my phone screen. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. I could only listen as the sound continued down the hallway, getting closer. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe silently. The air in the house had changed, thicker, colder, like something was watching me. I wanted to convince myself it was my imagination, that the storm had played tricks on my ears. But deep down, I knew better. Then, the tapping stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that feels like a living thing, pressing against you, waiting. And then, a whisper. So quiet, so faint, that I almost wasn't sure I heard it. But I did. A voice from the darkness, just beyond the living room. I see you. My heart slammed against my ribs. I swallowed back a scream, my body finally responding. I spun around and bolted toward the kitchen, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the drawer by the sink. My fingers found the handle of a knife. Cold, solid, real. I gripped it so tight my knuckles turned white. I was not going to die here. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room for a split second. A shape, standing at the end of the hallway. I barely saw it before the darkness swallowed it again. But that single glimpse was enough. Tall, thin, wrong. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. My lungs burned, desperate for air. But I was too afraid to breathe, too afraid to move. And then, footsteps. Not heavy, not rushed. Just slow, deliberate, coming toward me. I took a step back, my brain scrambling for a plan. The back door. If I could make it outside, I could run. My car was in the driveway, but my keys were still in my room. There was no time. If I could just get out of the house, maybe I could make it to the tree line and hide. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, gripping the knife tighter. Then, a creak. The sound of a door opening. Not just any door. The door to my bedroom. I almost dropped the knife. My bedroom. The only place I might have been able to hide. The thing was in there now. This was my chance. I turned and ran. I tore through the kitchen, my bare feet slamming against the cold tile as I sprinted toward the back door. The storm raged outside, rain hammering against the windows like nails on glass. My fingers fumbled with the lock, slick with sweat. Come on, come on. The lock clicked open. I ripped the door open, the wind nearly tearing it from my grip as I stumbled onto the back porch. The rain was blinding, the darkness almost suffocating, but I ran. My lungs burned as I sprinted across the yard, my mind screaming for me to keep moving, keep going. And then, through the storm, I heard it. Laughter. Not behind me, not from inside the house. Ahead. I skidded to a stop, my breath hitching in my throat. Another flash of lightning, and I saw them. 3 figures, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I felt my knees go weak. My grip on the knife loosened. The figure in the center, the tall, thin one, tilted its head as if studying me, grinning. I took a step back, my entire body trembling. The storm howled around us, thunder crashing so loud I felt it in my chest. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and then, from behind me, a voice. Don't run. I didn't think. I just acted. I spun around, swinging the knife blindly. Nothing. No one. But I had heard it. I know I heard it. I turned back toward the trees, and the figures were gone. The storm swallowed everything. The wind, the rain, the darkness. I stood there, soaked to the bone, alone. For the first time in my life, I truly felt what it was like to be hunted. I don't remember running back inside. I don't remember locking the doors or hiding under the kitchen table with the knife still clutched in my hands. I just remember waking up hours later, the morning sun pouring through the windows. The storm was gone. The world outside was calm. And yet, when I finally got the courage to check the front porch, I found footprints. Not muddy, not from the storm. Bare feet, leading from the door, into the woods. I never stayed in that house alone again, and I never answered a knock at the door during a thunderstorm, because now I know better. Whoever, or whatever, is out there, is waiting. Thunderstorms had always been a source of comfort for me. Something about the low rumble of thunder and the rhythmic tapping of rain against my window made me feel safe, like the chaos outside created a barrier between me and the rest of the world. But that was before that night. Before I learned that there are things hidden in the noise, things that don't belong in this world. It happened last September, a Tuesday night. I remember because I had school the next morning, and I was already up way later than I should have been. The storm had started around midnight, a sudden downpour rattling the house and shaking the window frames. The power flickered once, then went out entirely, plunging my room into darkness. I sighed. Not again. Our house was in an old part of town, and every time a storm rolled through, the power grid acted like it had never seen rain before. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the screen flashing to life. 1:07 a.m. Battery at 42%. No Wi-Fi, no signal. Perfect. At first, I wasn't worried. I had a few games on my phone that worked offline, and I figured I'd play until I got tired enough to fall asleep. But as I lay there, the storm outside seemed to grow different. The rain hadn't let up, but the wind had died down completely. No distant car alarms. No rustling trees. Just silence. And then came the static. It started so quietly I almost didn't notice it. A faint, crackling hum, like the sound of a TV left on a dead channel. At first, I thought it was coming from my phone, but when I pressed it against my ear, the noise didn't change. Then I realized it was coming from inside my room. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to pound. The sound was growing louder, buzzing softly in the silence. It wasn't coming from my laptop, or my speakers, or anything electronic. I knew because the power was still out. But it was there, hanging in the air like a whisper just at the edge of my hearing. I turned on my phone's flashlight, scanning the room. Nothing looked out of place. My closet door was shut. My window was still latched. Just my messy desk, my laundry pile in the corner, and the radio. My stomach dropped. I had a small, old-fashioned shortwave radio sitting on my bookshelf. I'd picked it up from a flea market a few months back, thinking it looked cool. It was one of those vintage models with a turn dial for frequency and a long retractable antenna. The thing didn't have batteries. It only worked when it was plugged into the wall. And yet, somehow, the dial was slowly turning on its own. I felt my breath catch in my throat as the knob clicked softly, shifting frequencies. The static rose and fell in pitch, like something was trying to tune in. I swallowed hard. This wasn't possible. I reached out, hesitating only a second before grabbing the radio with my free hand. The plastic casing was ice cold. My fingers wrapped around the dial, stopping it from moving. The second I did, the static cut off completely. Silence. I sat there, frozen, every muscle in my body screaming at me to put the radio down and leave the room. But something about the sudden silence was worse. Like whatever had been on the other end was now waiting. Then, very faintly, a voice crackled through the speaker. Hello? I threw the radio across the room. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the antenna snapping on impact. But that didn't stop the voice. It was still coming through, warped and distorted, like a bad transmission from somewhere far away. Can hear me? I was shaking now. My rational brain was trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe there was some kind of backup power in the radio? Maybe a freak electrical charge from the storm? But deep down, I knew none of that made sense. I forced myself to move, my hand shaking as I grabbed my phone and turned on the camera. I needed to record this. Someone had to believe me. I slowly lifted the phone, hitting record as I aimed it at the radio on the floor. The screen showed nothing unusual, just the old, dented device sitting in a pile of clothes. But the voice, "You're listening, aren't you?" I flinched. It sounded clearer now. I stood up, backing toward my bedroom door. My instinct screamed at me to get out, to wake my mom, to do anything but stay in that room. But before I could move, the power came back on. The lamp beside my bed flickered to life, my laptop screen glowing softly. I gasped at the sudden change, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. And then I realized the radio was off. Not broken, not malfunctioning, just off, like nothing had ever happened. I stood there, staring at it for what felt like hours, trying to decide if I had just hallucinated the entire thing. Then, cautiously, I stepped forward and picked up the radio. The antenna was snapped in half, the back panel slightly loose from the impact. I turned it over, checking the battery compartment, just to be sure. Still empty. A cold chill ran through me. I shut off my light, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers up to my chin. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired, that the storm had played tricks on my mind. I almost believed it. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, the voice returned. Not from the radio, not from my phone, from the foot of my bed. "I see you." My body locked up. My breathing stopped. I did not look. I stayed completely still, my face buried in my pillow, my fingers gripping the blankets so hard they ached. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but I knew that if I turned around, if I looked at whatever was behind me, something would be there. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. I couldn't even hear the storm outside anymore. Just my own shaky breaths, the slow creak of my mattress as something shifted. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The storm returned. The wind howled. The rain lashed against my window. I opened my eyes, gasping like I had just surfaced from underwater. My room was empty. The radio was gone. I never found it. But sometimes, when a storm rolls in late at night, when the thunder rumbles just right, I swear, I still hear that voice crackling through the air, waiting, listening. And if I listen too closely, it hears me too. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through every possible explanation for what had happened. I knew what I heard. I knew what I felt. But I refused to acknowledge the possibility that something had been in my room, that something had been watching me. By the time the first hints of morning light crept through my blinds, I forced myself out of bed. My limbs were stiff, my muscles sore from how tense I'd been all night. My first instinct was to check the floor where the radio had been. It was still gone. I tore through my room, checking under the bed, in the closet, even in my laundry pile. Nothing. It had vanished. I wanted to believe that maybe I had thrown it away in a sleep-deprived haze, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Because when I checked my phone, the video was still there. I hesitated before playing it back, my thumb hovering over the screen. My stomach twisted as I finally pressed play. The footage was shaky, the dim glow of my flashlight illuminating the radio on the floor. My breathing was loud, uneven. And then, the voice. "You're listening, aren't you?" I nearly dropped the phone. The voice was clear as day. Not distorted, not garbled like a radio transmission. It sounded like someone was standing right next to me. But the worst part? There was another sound underneath it. A faint, wet breathing, right behind the camera. I slammed my phone down on my desk, my pulse thudding in my ears. What the hell was that? I had to tell someone. Anyone. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding as I pulled up my best friend Brandon's contact. My fingers hovered over the call button. No signal. I glanced at my Wi-Fi. Still down. Of course. The storm had knocked everything out. Frustrated, I decided I'd just have to show him in person at school. But when I got to first period and pulled out my phone, the video was gone. Not in my gallery. Not in my deleted files. Just erased. Like it had never existed. I felt sick. I tried to tell Brandon about what had happened. But the more I explained, the crazier it sounded. A radio turning on by itself? Some creepy voice? Bro, you were probably just half asleep, he said, scrolling through his phone without even looking at me. And storms mess with electronics, right? Maybe it picked up a weird signal or something. I wanted to argue, but what could I say? That a voice in my room had spoken to me? That the radio vanished into thin air? That my video was somehow deleted by something that didn't want me to have proof? I gave up. By the time I got home, I had almost convinced myself that maybe he was right. Maybe my mind had been playing tricks on me. But then I walked into my room, and the radio was back, sitting perfectly centered on my desk. My stomach twisted into knots. No, I threw that thing across the room. I checked. It was gone. And yet, there it was. Pristine. Like it had never been broken in the first place. Something was wrong. I took a shaky step forward. The second I did, the dial moved. I watched, my breath hitching, as the knob began to turn on its own. Slowly, deliberately. Click, click, click. The static came back, crackling through the tiny speaker. My fingers curled into fists at my sides. I didn't run this time. I didn't throw it. Instead, I reached out and turned the dial myself. The static shifted, the white noise breaking apart. And then, through the storm of sound, something answered. A voice. But this time, it was clear. It was me. My own voice, distorted, crackling through the speakers. Don't run. I stumbled backwards so fast I nearly tripped over my chair. No, that wasn't possible. How? The voice repeated, warping, stretching, as if something else was speaking through it. Don't run. I slammed my hand against the radio, knocking it off the desk. The second it hit the floor, the voice cut out, the static vanishing with it. The only sound left was my own ragged breathing. I stared down at the thing, my entire body trembling. I had to get rid of it. This time, I wasn't just going to throw it in my closet. I was going to take it outside. I grabbed the radio and bolted down the stairs, nearly knocking over the kitchen chair in my rush to get to the back door. The sky had darkened again, heavy clouds rolling in fast. Another storm was coming. Good. I ran across the yard, my shoes sinking into the damp earth. The woods behind my house loomed ahead, dark and endless, but I didn't care. I flung the radio as hard as I could. It disappeared into the trees. I stood there, panting, watching as the first raindrops began to fall. It was over. It had to be. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself I wouldn't think about it anymore, that I had one. But later that night, as the storm raged outside, I woke up to static. Not from my phone, not from my laptop, from the corner of my room. I sat up slowly, my entire body cold with fear. The darkness felt thicker now, pressing against my skin. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and there it was, sitting on my desk. The radio. I never brought it back inside. My breath came in shallow gasps, my fingers digging into my sheets. And then, the dial started to turn. I couldn't move, couldn't blink. The static rose, shifting, twisting, until I heard it. A whisper. So quiet, so close. It felt like someone was speaking directly into my ear. I found you. The lights flickered. The storm roared outside. And then, the radio turned itself off. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I took the radio and drove 10 miles out of town before throwing it into the deepest part of the river. I watched it sink, the dark water swallowing it whole. I told myself it was gone for good. But sometimes, late at night, when the sky rumbles with thunder, I hear the static again. And I know, somewhere out there, it's still listening. I never used to be afraid of thunderstorms. They were just noise and light, something to watch from the safety of my room while rain drummed against the roof. But now, when I hear thunder rolling in the distance, my stomach tightens, because I know he is out there, waiting. It started 3 years ago, on a night when the rain came down so hard it felt like the sky was splitting open. The power had gone out just after midnight, leaving the house in total darkness except for the brief, eerie flashes of lightning through my bedroom window. I was 15 at the time, living with my mom and my little brother, Ryan. My dad had passed away when I was 10, and since then, it had just been the three of us in our small house at the edge of town. We weren't completely isolated, but our closest neighbors were half a mile down the road, which meant when the power went out, we were truly alone. That night, I stayed up later than I should have, scrolling through my phone with what little battery I had left. The storm outside was relentless, thunder rattling the windows, wind howling through the trees in the backyard. And then, right between two flashes of lightning, I saw him, a figure standing at the tree line, motionless. I sat up so fast my phone nearly slipped from my hands. The next bolt of lightning lit up the backyard again, but this time, he was closer. I scrambled out of bed, my heart slamming against my ribs. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, that I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew better. I kept staring out the window, waiting for the next flash of light. When it finally came, my breath caught in my throat. He was standing just beyond the porch now. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see his shape, tall, thin. His body eerily still despite the wind whipping around him. His head was tilted slightly, like he was listening. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering. My mind raced with excuses. Maybe it was a lost traveler. Maybe one of our distant neighbors needed help. But deep down, I knew he wasn't supposed to be there. Then, he moved. Not a normal movement. Not like walking. It was like a flicker. One moment, he was on the porch. The next, he was at the back door. I ran. I tore down the hall, straight to Ryan's room. He was only 10 at the time, and the last thing I wanted was for him to wake up and see that thing standing outside. I shook him awake. "Ryan, get up." He groaned. "What? What's wrong?" I hesitated. I didn't want to scare him. Hell, I didn't even know how to explain it myself. But before I could say anything, we both heard it. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the glass of the back door. Ryan's eyes went wide. "Who's that?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know." The tapping came again, louder this time. I grabbed Ryan's wrist and pulled him out of bed. "Come on." We hurried down the hall to Mom's room. I pushed the door open. Empty. The bed was unmade, but she wasn't there. "Mom." My voice came out shaky, barely louder than a whisper. The wind howled outside, the storm growing fiercer. Thunder rumbled so deeply that I could feel it in my chest. And then, the power came back on. The house was flooded with light, and for a split second, I felt relief. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe whoever was outside would leave now. Maybe it was just some random creep trying to scare us, and with the lights back on, he'd think twice about breaking in. I turned to Ryan. "Stay here. I'm gonna check the..." Then we heard the front door creak open. I felt every muscle in my body lock up. Not the back door. Not the one where the tapping had come from. The front door. Someone had come inside. Ryan grabbed my arm, his little fingers digging into my skin. I could feel his entire body trembling. Then, footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps moving across the wooden floor of the living room. I reached for my phone. My fingers were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I pulled up my contacts, my thumb hovering over 911. But before I could press it, a voice. "Hello?" I nearly screamed. It was Mom's voice, but it wasn't her. I knew that immediately. The tone was off. The cadence was wrong. It sounded empty, like someone was repeating her voice without actually understanding the words. Ryan let out a small whimper. I clamped my hand over his mouth. Then the voice came again, closer this time. "Hello? Are you there?" I peeked through the crack in the bedroom door and saw a shadow in the hallway. It was too tall to be Mom. Its limbs were too long, its shoulders too sharp. But the worst part? It was moving wrong, like something trying to imitate the way a person walks, but getting the details slightly off. Ryan squeezed his eyes shut, his breath hitching beneath my hand. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to drag Ryan out the window and bolt into the storm, but I was too afraid to move. And then, it spoke again. But this time, it wasn't Mom's voice. It was mine. "Ryan? It's okay. Come out." My blood turned to ice. Ryan stiffened. I could feel his tiny body shake against me, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The thing outside the door took a step forward. "Come out, Ryan," it repeated in my voice. "It's just me. It's just your brother." My stomach twisted into knots. It knew our names. Ryan clutched my shirt, his tiny fingers digging into my side. He looked up at me, terrified, waiting for me to tell him what to do. But I didn't have a plan. I could only watch as the shadow in the hallway shifted and reached for the door handle. The knob turned. I sucked in a sharp breath, every nerve in my body screaming, "Move, move, move." And then, a crash of thunder shook the house. The lights flickered. For a split second, in that flash of dim, flickering light, I saw it. The thing in the hallway. It wasn't human. Its face, stretched, warped, like wet paper over something wrong underneath. Its eyes too large, too empty. And then, the lights went out again. Everything plunged into darkness. And in the blackness, right outside the door, I heard it whisper, in my own trembling voice, "Don't be afraid." The door handle twisted. I felt Ryan flinch against me, his little hands gripping my shirt so tightly I thought he'd tear it. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my weight against the door, my mind screaming at me to do something. Asterisk, asterisk, anything. Asterisk, asterisk, before that thing came inside. The house had been swallowed by total darkness, the only light coming in brief, violent flashes from the storm outside. I could feel the pressure in the air shift, that deep, unnatural stillness just before lightning struck. And then, the door creaked open an inch. I clamped my hand over Ryan's mouth before he could scream. "Don't let it in. Don't let it in." I wasn't sure if I was telling him or myself. The shadow in the hallway stretched into the room as the door inched open. My chest tightened. I could see its hand now, long, bony fingers curling around the edge of the door. Too many joints. The skin looked wrong. Stretched. Pulled too tight over something underneath. Ryan's tiny body shook against me. I held him tighter, barely breathing. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to blink. And then, it spoke. "Ryan." My stomach clenched. It was still using my voice. Ryan whimpered softly against my palm. The thing behind the door let out a low, distorted chuckle. The sound wasn't right. Like someone had recorded my laugh and then slowed it down, twisting it into something unnatural. I could hear it breathing now. Deep, rattling, wet. It was waiting for us to answer. I felt a lump rise in my throat. My fingers curled into a fist. I had to do something. If I just sat here, it was going to come inside. And then what? I didn't want to know. Lightning flashed, and for half a second, I saw it. Its face. No, my face. A warped, distorted copy of me. Stretched like melted wax, the eyes sunken in too deep, the mouth too wide. It was grinning. The light vanished. The room was dark again. I moved before I could think. I grabbed the lamp from Mom's nightstand and swung it at the door as hard as I could. It smashed into the wood with a loud crack, knocking the door halfway shut. The thing shrieked. Not a human sound. Something else. I didn't stop to look. I grabbed Ryan and ran. We tore through the hallway, my feet barely touching the ground. Behind us, I could hear heavy footsteps pounding against the floor, too fast, too wrong. It was chasing us. I grabbed the stair railing and flung us both down the steps just as a deafening boom of thunder shook the house. The front door. If we could just get outside. We sprinted through the living room, Ryan gasping beside me. The storm was raging now, wind rattling the windows, rain slamming against the roof. I reached the door, my shaking hands fumbling with the lock. "Come on, come on." Ryan was crying now. "Please hurry," he sobbed. Behind us, I heard the thing in the hallway laugh. I yanked the door open and froze. Outside, standing in the storm, was Mom. But something was wrong. Her eyes weren't right. Her skin looked too pale. And she wasn't blinking. She stood there, perfectly still, rain dripping down her face. The wind didn't move her hair, just like the thing in the house. "Mom," I whispered. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was his. I grabbed Ryan and slammed the door shut. The thing in the hallway screamed. A horrible, guttural sound that made my ears ring. The walls shook. The lights flickered. The air felt wrong, like the whole house was bending, warping around us. And then, silence. No more screaming. No more footsteps. Just the soft hum of the wind outside. Ryan was still sobbing against my chest. I pressed my back against the door, my heart pounding. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. Finally, I swallowed hard. I stood up on shaking legs and peered through the peephole. The front porch was empty. No mom. No thing. The storm had started to die down, the rain softening against the roof. I let out a shaky breath. It was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Neither did Ryan. We sat in the living room with every light in the house on, listening, waiting for something to come back. Nothing did. By morning, everything felt normal again. Except Mom still wasn't home. I called her over and over. No answer. Then, around noon, the front door opened. She walked in, shaking rain from her coat. "Hey, kids," she said, pulling her shoes off. "Sorry I got stuck at work last night. The storm knocked out the roads, and my phone died." Ryan and I just stared at her. She looked fine, normal, like nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She smiled at me. "You okay?" I forced a nod. "Yeah, just a rough night." She ruffled my hair, then turned toward the kitchen, and as she walked away, for just a split second, I could have sworn her reflection in the hallway mirror didn't move. I didn't say anything, but that night, long after Mom and Ryan had gone to bed, I lay awake, listening to the wind, and somewhere, deep in the storm, I thought I heard someone laughing.